Chapter 10, Democracy in America, 1815 to 1840. In other words, we're going to start right after the War of 1812 and go through 1840. Now, you ladies and gentlemen should be very happy with this chapter. It's much shorter in lecture than it was the last one. We don't have very few pictures and 2 short YouTubes at the end of the lecture. That being said, during this time, maybe after the War of 1812, starting in 1815, a lot of the property requirements for voting were abolished, except in the South. They're very slow to eliminate them. But the main thing that had to be done, you had to own yourself, which meant that you couldn't be a slave. But we had some people in Rhode Island who were very unhappy, the factory workers. They started what's called a factory worker movement. They got together and called a People's Convention, and they drafted the Constitution, and they elected a man named Thomas Dorr as their governor. Now, let's be honest about this. The little bitty state of Rhode Island is going to split off and cause problems. Well, at this time, John Tyler was president. He threatened to send in the federal troops, and it was kind of another tempest in a teapot. But democracy is like eating popcorn. You can't just eat one piece. The more you have, the more you want. But by 1840, more than 90% of all adult white men could vote. And when the French writer, who was an aristocrat from France, Alex de Tocqueville, visited us, he saw this democracy. He said, the Americans seem to feel the right to vote, and participation in politics offers them a sense of national identity. But he didn't like democracy. He thought it was a way to get on the road to anarchy. But also during this time, we had this new marvelous invention. And we had a bunch of them last chapter, remember? Every time we turn around, somebody's inventing something new to make it easier to do something. A steam-powered printing press, which meant that we could print faster and cheaper and make things more available to the public. You start having dime novels and nickel magazines, and everybody's producing a paper. And, of course, you have something called sensational journalism, and pornography also published. But every organization prints their own paper. This is a new venue for the expression. But there are limits to democracy. Women and non-whites lack qualities necessary. And these qualities are fixed by nature. Women had freedom in the home, or so they say. She has freedom in the home as long as she doesn't do anything to upset her husband. But freedom in private did not mean freedom in the public sphere. We still had a women's sphere. We are becoming obsessed with equality, but it's becoming more and more associated with whiteness of the skin. And most white Americans dress pretty much the same and similar and mingled among each other. But they did not allow blacks to mingle, and they did not allow the blacks to wear the same type of clothing. They were excluded totally from the public white life. This ideology of superiority begins to develop, and it's based on scientific studies made by brilliant archaeologists and scientists and doctors and lawyers and ministers, that only the white man is superior, that the black race is inferior for some reason. It's because their skin is black, because their brain is too big or too little. They've come up with all kinds of supposed studies. Yet after 1800, only Maine allowed blacks to vote. And while New York didn't say they couldn't vote, they didn't have any property restrictions for the white race, but they did have a monetary qualification for the Africans. So there was no full equality of any kind anywhere. If you were white, you could go to school, you could join the militia, you could join organizations. But if you were black or Hispanic or anything considered an inferior race, you were barred from the public schools and the militia. So we've become a classless society in theory, but in reality, race is just replacing class. Now, Henry Clay of Kentucky had talked to President Madison back in 1816, 17, somewhere along in there, came up with an idea called the American system. He says, we need to protect the American businesses and help them grow, and the best way to do this is to keep out foreign competition. So let's have huge, high tariffs. And the money that we collect from these tariffs, we're going to use to improve the infrastructure. We're going to build canals and roads and encourage manufacturing. Well, this is fine. Sounds good. And the Bank of the United States, which is called thus, I love that, is a private-making corporation. And it's going to serve as a government's financial agent. Well, this all sounds good. It sounds like Hamilton would be very pleased. Now, Henry Clay is 1/3 of what we call the Golden Triumvirate. Another third is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. The other third is Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts is a dyed-in-the-wool against slavery. John C. Calhoun is the mouth of the South, very pro-slavery. Henry Clay is a moderator. He's in the middle. You've got the Southerner, you've got the Northerner, and you've got the man in the middle who's going to pour oil on troubled waters to calm things down. Now, after the War of 1812, toward the end of 1819, there'd been a lot of speculation in land, and the bubble burst. And it was a short depression. Well, like I said, it was short-lived. But it just seemed to prove to the public that the Bank of the United States couldn't be trusted, because you've got to blame somebody. It can't be my fault because I speculated too much. It's got to be that bank's fault. And to get back at the banks, the individual states started taxing the bank. Now, the Supreme Court's ruled that the bank is legitimate, and you really shouldn't do this. But right after this war, ended in 1815, it's called the Era of Good Feeling. Now, Madison doesn't run for the third time because the president has been set just 2 terms. So James Monroe becomes president. And at this point in time, we only have one political party. The Republican Party's dead. There's no party disunity. The Republicans are ruling, and everything looks good. It's going to be great. And then all of a sudden, sectional disputes. And the slavery issue rears its ugly head. The territory of Missouri had satisfied all federal requirements to be made, and it requested to be admitted to the United States as a slave state. What's the problem? Well, in 1819, we had 22 states. 11 states allowed slavery, and 11 states did not. So what's the big deal? Because in the Senate, every state, large or small, only gets 2 senators. And with 22 states, 11 slave and 11 non-slave, you had a balance in the Senate, so neither side had the upper hand. But if Missouri came in as a slave state, now you've got 12 slave states and 11 non-slave states, so the South has the advantage. And she's already got the advantage in the House of Representatives. So New York proposes a ban. Okay, Missouri, ban any further importation of slaves, and any slaves you've got, children that are over 25, free them. New York says, that's not a great idea. The South, under John C. Calhoun, says, whoa, don't think so. Not going to have that. If you do that, we're going to secede from the Union. Enter Henry Clay, and this is where he gets his reputation, not as being a war hawk and wanting to go to war with Great Britain. He gets a reputation as the great compromiser. He comes up with a compromise, and this is not the entire compromise, but it's the part you need to remember. Missouri can come in as a slave state, but we're going to bring in a state as a free state to balance it out. So in 1822, we're going to have 12 free and 12 slaves. So every time you bring in a slave state, you bring in a free state. You bring in a free state, you bring in a slave state to keep that balance going. And it will last for decades. Although not written, it was kind of an unaccepted rule. We're going to prohibit slavery in the Louisiana Purchase north of the 3630 longitude, which is basically the Ohio River. So what's happened is, without even realizing it, the South has had a fence put around it. As you can see here, here's the Ohio River. Now, all this, you can't have slaves. Actually, you've got Missouri, which is above the line, but this was to be allowed. It became a slave state in 1822. It took them 2 years to iron out all the difficulties. But everything north of here is supposed to be free. And Spain still got all this out here, so that's no problem right now. But like I said, the South, we've got plenty of land. And in square mileage, we've got more land than the North has, so they're not really concerned right now. Meanwhile, we got wars of independence going on in Central and South America. Mexico, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru declared their independence from Spain. And the only thing left of the Spanish Empire in this hemisphere now is Cuba and Puerto Rico. And of course, the United States was the first to jump in and recognize the new governments. Now, Secretary of State John Adams, under Mr. Monroe, had learned, had found out, had heard that Spain was going to try to reclaim some of the lost land. So they got together, he got together with the British ambassadors, because we didn't have much of an army or navy at this point in time. And with promised aid from Great Britain, they issued something called the Monroe Doctrine, because President Monroe was the president, right? The United States would oppose any efforts by Europe to colonize any further in the Americas. And we said we will keep ourselves out of Europe's business, and Europe should keep her nose out of the Americas. Like we've ever gotten involved in them. And how were we going to prevent it? Well, we were going to have the support of the British Navy. So as you can see from the map, all of the mighty Spanish Empire, which used to include all of this, is now down to Cuba and Puerto Rico, right here. That's it. Now, John Quincy Adams, he's a character. He, the son of John Adams, the second president of the United States. He's a former senator and he's a diplomat. He supported Henry Clay's American system, and he didn't just help write the Monroe Doctrine. We have the opinion that he probably wrote the entire thing. But he wanted to help increase Americans' commerce, and he hoped that the United States eventually would be able to take over Canada, Cuba, and part of Mexico. Well, eventually we're going to get part of Mexico, but we're not going to get Cuba for another almost 100 years. And even then we didn't totally control it. That's another story. But we've tried to gain Canada every time there's any disruption anywhere. He's got a very broad view of the federal power, and he, like I say, he endorses the American system, and he wanted the United States government to build a naval and national academy to educate future officers for the military. Of course, most of his opponents said, no, 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 limited federal government role in politics. But Adams truly believed that liberty is power, and they reinforce each other. Now, we have a presidential election in 1824, where now Monroe has done his terms. You're going to have Andrew Jackson, John Adams, Crawford, and Clay, favorite sons of their states. Crawford of Georgia and Clay of Kentucky, and they're going to run for president. And since no one received the majority, although Jackson received the biggest number of popular votes, no one had the majority of the electoral votes, so the top three vote getters were going to be thrown into the House of Representatives, and Clay was eliminated. But he did have electoral votes pledged to him. We gave them to Adams, and Adams wound up winning. Not the popular vote, but the electoral vote. And as soon as he takes office, he appoints Secretary of State, appoints Clay to be Secretary of State. And of course, Jackson called it the corrupt bargain. But it laid the basis for the emergence of the Democratic Party behind Andrew Jackson's candidacy in the next election in 1828. And the alliance around Adams and Clay are going to form the opposition party called the Whig Party, which will be formed 2 years later. So we've gone from a one-party system of Republicans to now we've got two. And of course, the Democratic Party is not the same party we know today. It was a party of Southerners. The old leftovers of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party is now just the Democratic Party, predominantly Southern. And the Whigs are going to be, well, the Whigs' name is taken from the English political party who were opposed to monarchy. And they're opposing Andrew Jackson. This is a picture of Mr. Adams. Bless his heart. He looks like he's been sucking a lemon, doesn't he? Now, Martin Van Buren was a New York senator, not president yet. The son of a tavern keeper, he was an ordinary man, but he believed that parties and competition was good for the U.S., stir him up a little bit. He was very alarmed with his sectionalism over slavery, and he helps create a very vibrant Democratic Party before the 1828 election. And vibrant it is. Look at it. It was practically a majority vote for Jackson. It looks like everybody except New York, New Jersey, all the New England states went Whig. But very few voted for Adams. Oh dear, I misspelled Andrew. I apologize. I used the right finger, just the wrong letter. Andrew Jackson, at his inauguration, more than 20,000 people went through the White House. They took souvenirs, they destroyed things. It was just really bad. A beer bus gone wild. But there were a lot of major developments in Jackson's term of office during this time. And his presidency and life reflect the power of the market revolution, which he did not approve of, westward expansion, which he did approve of, the spread of slavery, which he approved of, and the growth of democracy, which it seems strange when you talk about the spread of slavery and democracy in the same sentence. But Jackson symbolized a self-made man, having risen from a supposed humble frontier background in South Carolina and Tennessee. He was a lawyer, he practiced law, he served in the state's legislature, and he practiced before courts, all before winning fame as a famous general in the Battle of New Orleans. But most important, he seemed to represent the rise of political democracy for the common man. He was a man of contradictions. As I said, modest beginnings to become a very rich man who owned plantations and slaves. He disliked banks, he didn't like paper money, He did not like some of the results of the market revolution. He was a strong nationalist, but he also believed that states, not the federal government, should govern. He opposed any intervention by the federal government in the economy or interference in public life. During his term of office and right before the party system really began to solidify, each one of the parties had their own newspapers and they sponsored parades. Each of them would come up with a speaker who was a great orator. And large national political parties and the urban political machine became developed. And it would dispense patronage in the forms of jobs and assistance, and they did do some good. You go to town as a new immigrant or somebody from that sticks out in the country, come to town, you go to your local political boss and he would help you find a job or a place to live, which was good, kind of an early welfare program. But unfortunately, they also wielded an awful lot of political power. Andrew Jackson himself is going to introduce something called the spoils system, in which the new administration replaces the old administration's appointees with their own party. In other words, you supported me, I'm going to support you. Let's take a real quick look at some of the differences between the Democrats under Jackson and the Whigs. Under Jackson, they believed that liberty was a private thing. It should be protected by the state. They also believed that the federal power should be weak, and that private freedom and states' rights were the key. They reduced spending, they lowered tariffs, and they killed the bank. They also refused federal aid for internal improvements because they didn't approve of that. And they believed that the individual's morality was his private concern, and that states' rights should and protect slavery. For the Whigs, they believed that liberty and power reinforced each other. They actually thought that an energetic federal government enhanced freedom and liberty, and it required a prosperous and moral America to accomplish this. And they also believed the government could and should create the conditions for economic developments, which would produce prosperity for all classes and all regions. And like the long-gone Federalists, the wealthy Whigs saw society as a hierarchy of social classes. But unlike the Federalists, they believed that class status was not fixed in cement, that individuals through hard work could rise up in society. They also believed that the government should and could intervene in the individual's life to ensure that they acted as free moral agents. And because of this, they supported, federally supported schools. They supported temperance laws, drinking against the law, and Sabbath laws. Now, Jackson was dedicated to states' rights. And in his first term, he made every effort to uphold the supremacy of the federal government. Now, in 1828, a tariff which raised taxes on imported goods, it caused a lot of opposition in the South, especially South Carolina, where it was called the Tariff of Dominations. They believed that this tariff was punishing Southern consumers in order to benefit Northern industry. So South Carolina's legislature threatened to nullify it, declare it null and void in South Carolina. Now, South Carolina had a higher percentage of slaves than any other state and was ruled by the oligarchic elite of large plantation owners. And they were very alarmed over this Missouri controversy and the growing federal power. So Jackson's vice president, who was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, came up with a theory of nullification. In it, he argued that the states had created the national government, and each state retained the right to prevent the enforcement of Congress's laws within its borders that it deemed to exceed the powers written in the Constitution. Well, opponents like Daniel Webster of the North argued that the people, not the states, had created the Constitution, and the federal government and the nullification was illegal, unconstitutional, and treasonous. Whoa. Well, no other state threatened nullification. And Calhoun's theory offered the South a political philosophy to use when sectionalism was going to intensify later on. He argued the theory did not threaten disunion, but preserved it. It allowed unique and diverse states to preserve their interests while retaining part of the federal union. But to President Jackson, nullification was disunion. And in 1832, when a new tariff was enacted, South Carolina declared it was null and void the very next year. Well, President Jackson, his bluff has been called, it looks like. He managed to persuade Congress to give him the right to use the military to go in and collect the tax. So to avoid war, enter Henry Clay again. Along with John C. Calhoun, they created a compromise tariff in 1833 that reduced the duties, and South Carolina then rescinded the nullification law. Calhoun abandoned his Democratic Party and Jackson for the Whigs, and Clay and Webster. But the three of them became united over their hatred for Jackson, and Calhoun resigned as vice president and was reelected immediately as senator from South Carolina. So the nullification problem was the first big problem that Jackson faced. Now, the last Indian resistance in the Old Northwest, as it was called, was a victory at the Black Hawk War in 1832. And in the South, cotton spread introduced very much land-hungry white settlers into areas where the civilized tribes of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Creek, they had long practiced white ways, which even included slavery. But back in 1830, Jackson had secured passage of the Indian Removal Act, which allowed for the removal of tens of thousands of Indians from the Southwest. And this law repudiated Jackson's notion that Indians could be assimilated and eventually incorporated into white America. The Cherokee in Georgia, they didn't like this. They did something very unusual. They had their own government, their own constitution, schools, and even an English written newspaper. And they went to the Supreme Court. They said, protect our land. It's been guaranteed to us in treaties and the federal government. And in 1832, the federal court decided that Indians did not, in fact, own their land, but rather were nomads who only had a right of occupancy. The next court decision defined Indians as wards of the federal government who did not have full rights as citizens and were not independent nations sovereign from state governments. The subsequent decision made, it made them independent nations. And then there was another one that reversed it. And see, the Supreme Court's all over the place. They gave Indians a right to have themselves called a nation and a separate political identity and to deal with the federal government as individual states. But Jackson refused to enforce the last decision. And he told Georgia to go ahead and expel the Cherokee with the help of the federal government. And troops were sent in to forcibly remove them into what we call the Trail of Tears. Jackson basically said to the Supreme Court, you made the rule and I'm supposed to see you enforce it. The Seminole in Florida resisted forcefully. I fought a very human, expensive guerrilla warfare, but eventually they were overcome. And by the 1840s, all the Indians in Alabama, or the area we're going to call Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, they're gone. Moved to the flatlands of Oklahoma. What Jackson did was blatantly unconstitutional. Tens of thousands of Indians were killed. The next thing he faced was a bank war and after. And I guess you call it this most significant political fight. Jackson was afraid that the National Bank or the Bank of the United States was going to use its power and money against him in the next election. So when a request came through to extend the charter before the charter was up, he vetoed it. So by vetoing it, he claimed that the charter widened the gulf between the haves and the have-nots and the humble farmers and mechanics and laborers who I'm chosen to defend. He enhanced the power of the presidency. He was the first president to use the power of the veto as a major weapon. Now, when this was over with, you have what he called soft money, which is paper currency, hard money, which is gold and silver. And the local banks he'd pick a favorite bank and deposit federal money in there. And the bank began printing money like it was going out of style. There was no regulations against it. And there was just so much soft money in circulation that, prices are rising, wages are declining, and speculators are prospering like crazy. But then all of a sudden in 1836, the bubble burst. And there was a depression. And it lasted until 1843. This is just a picture of where the Indians were removed from the South. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Seminoles, Creek, all moved to the Indian lands. This is an unusual one. This was one by a man called Hughes. I think you'll find it quite different from Mr. Green's. And this is just about Jackson. Okay, Mr. Hughes.
guys, welcome back to History's History. What we would like to do in this lecture, in the next few minutes of your life, is to go through the essentials of Andrew Jackson. Nothing too fancy. We're not going to get all book learning on you, but we do want to cover the essentials, what you need to know. So whether you're in an American history course or you just surf the net to wrinkle your brain, we got it going on here. So sit back and relax and giddy up. Here comes Andrew Jackson. All right, let's keep it simple. Andrew Jackson is a land surveyor. He is a slave owner. He owns plantations. He married into money and becomes really good at kind of gathering land back then down in the southeast, where there's still a Native American presence. And this is where in the Tennessee military he becomes well known as a commander, in a sense, when he battles the Red Sticks. The Red Sticks were basically conformed of different Native American tribes, really the Creeks being the biggest one, led by the Native American revolutionary Tecumseh. And Tecumseh is defeated, and the Red Sticks are broken at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. And it is here that Andrew Jackson really begins to make his mark, as that treaty really broke the Creeks and started pushing Native Americans out. And it was well known that Andrew Jackson would use bribery, that Andrew Jackson would encourage white settlers to go squat on Native American land, and then he would go to the Native Americans and go, "What am I going to do? I get this guy, you better move." So he is pretty ruthless. He didn't get the name Old Hickory for being a softy at heart. Where does he really become well known? It's the Battle of New Orleans. In 1815, after the War of 1812 was already over, there's another battle. Isn't that awesome? A battle after the war. And that battle is where Andrew Jackson defeats Great Britain and becomes really kind of the hero of the War of 1812 that we lost. Go figure. All right, let's get this guy elected president soon enough. All right, so Andrew Jackson, kind of wearing this hero badge, goes on and he becomes kind of another leader in the Seminole War, defeating the Seminoles in Florida. And that's a really great story if you ever learn about that. And the black slaves that would escape to Florida and marry in with the Seminoles. And kind of Andrew Jackson is kind of given the job of chasing after those black slaves and returning them and breaking the Seminoles, which leads to the treaty with Spain. And we get Florida, comes the governor of Florida. And now he's moving up, right? In 1824, he got his first shot. And he was defeated by John Quincy Adams. I think that election was chosen in the House of Representatives. But nevertheless, he is now on his way. And what he did was he created really the first modern version of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party of today is not the Democratic Party of yesterday. This is a party of the South. This is a party that's built after the former remnants of what we would consider kind of the anti-Feds or the Democratic Republicans. It is states' rights orientated. It is against Northern interests. This is where we get that kind of common man era. And, I feel a little weird saying that, Jackson's the leader of new democracy in America because, he thinks Native Americans are savages and black people are property. But nevertheless, it's that idea that poor white people are beginning to participate, that their voices are beginning to be heard in this new Democratic Party. And therefore, he's going to use that with the expansion of voting rights after we eliminate property rights in states to get elected in 1828. So Andrew Jackson is now the 7th president of the United States. He's a kind of a commoner in the eyes of many Americans, even though he owns slaves and plantations. But nevertheless, this guy is ready to go. So let's look at his policies and what the multiple choice vocabulary is, because I know you're out there going, Hughes, give me the vocab. All right, so a few policies that are really, really important. One would definitely be the idea that he was against the national bank. And this idea still lives today in the kind of modern era Ron Paul libertarian concept of really not trusting northern or northeastern business and money and government interests controlling money, because there's a lot of manipulation that might go on. So Andrew Jackson is going to veto the national bank, and that's kind of one of the multiple choice questions, that he's against northern money interest, and he uses his power of president to break the national bank rechartering and vetoes it. Another concept is, and this is kind of a weird concept, because I told you he was for states' rights, and he is for states' rights, but nevertheless, there's a tariff crisis in the early 1830s or in 1832 when he was reelected. And basically, it's the concept of nullification. After the Congress and this Tariff Act is passed, tariff is a tax on imports, the southern states kind of go bazooka. They're like, I ain't paying that tax, because this hurts me, baby. If I'm going to raise tax on French underwear, when I go to the store, all the underwear is going to be expensive. And Fruit of the Loom up north is going, this is awesome. Everyone's going to buy my underwear. So in a generality kind of way, the North likes tariffs because it insulates Northern manufacturers, while the Southern Democratic Party doesn't like tariffs because all the prices go up in Walmart. There's no Walmart. Please don't put that in your essay. But nevertheless, Jackson is supposedly anti-tariff. But when South Carolina and some of the other southern states were getting ready to do this too, nullify the Tariff Act. Nullify is a fancy way for saying, no, I ain't going to do it. I ain't going to do that. I ain't going to pay that. What are you going to do? What you going to do? What you going to do? Andrew Jackson going to kick your feet. Andrew Jackson uses the threat of military force with South Carolina. This is like a mini civil war in a sense, because he believed in the idea of national unity, that states' rights was important, that reserved powers in the 10th Amendment was important, but at the end of the day, we all belong to the United States of America, so therefore he rejected the concept of nullification. I got another answer at my foot. Let me pick it up and see what it took. All right, two more things, maybe three more things. I don't want this to go too long, but these are questions generally on exams in U.S. history. Another vocab word we'll throw at you is the spoils system. And the spoils system is really kind of a system of patronage that Andrew Jackson brings to the White House. Patronage is that you bring people with you. You bring your peeps. And kind of there's a positive and a negative kind of attribute to the concept of spoils system. In one sense, there's a large turnover. It's kind of that democratic idea that you got new blood and you got locals and you got people that haven't been involved in government before coming to government. But it's also that idea that this is bad because they don't have that skill set to run the post office, because these jobs are not always political. They're civil service jobs. Today we take a test to get a job in the post office. Back then you had to be a Jackson peep. To the winner goes the spoils, and Andrew Jackson brings that patronage system, which eventually will lead to the assassination of Garfield, President Garfield, by an upset job seeker, and that leads to the Pendleton Act, which gives us our modern civil service exams and systems. So thank you, Andrew Jackson. Okay, let's do it. Native Americans. Andrew Jackson wants them out. And really, America had a huge conversation at this time period of whether to, like, basically eliminate the savages or civilize the savages. And as awful as that sounds, it ends up being civilize the savages, although the ones that rebelled were killed. But Andrew Jackson wants these Native Americans out. He really supports the Indian Removal Act, which was a law passed by Congress that basically means what it says, that all of the Native American tribes down in the Southeast get the hell out. You got to go on the other side of the Mississippi. Eventually, we're going to push these Native Americans to Oklahoma because nothing grows in Oklahoma. But what's really interesting about the Indian Removal Act, and that's the vocab, man. If you want vocab, Andrew Jackson enforced the Indian Removal Act. That leads to the Trail of Tears, and it's just like the worst story ever. So I encourage you to read it. I'll put a link down below. Howard Zinn. Not everyone's going to love Howard Zinn, but Howard Zinn has an awesome chapter on Native American history that goes over the Trail of Tears that will make you cry because it's a sad story. But nevertheless, a court case that we're going to end this lecture with is Worcester versus Georgia. And in Worcester versus Georgia, I always do this with my kids. I go, basically, somebody is suing Georgia to stop the enforcement of the Indian Removal Act. A Native American interest, this is Worcester, is saying that this is unconstitutional, that you can't take people's property away and just shoo them like a fly, like get out of the room. And of course, in 1832, when this goes to the Supreme Court, who's the Supreme Court going to rule for? Come on, man. The Native Americans or the white guys, the government? It's the Native Americans. I shoot you not. Yeah, Marshall, I think, was still around. And Marshall basically writes his decision saying, you can't do this. The Constitution forbids this. And Jackson says, the hell are you going to do? You made your decision. You go enforce it, Marshall. What are you going to do? Towel whip me with your big black robe? Ooh, scary business. And sometimes you'll see kind of this poster, and maybe I'll put it right here, of kind of Andrew Jackson, right, with a crown on his head and standing on the Constitution. And that's that concept that he is basically ignoring judicial review. He's violating, in a sense, at least unwrittenly, the concept of separation of powers. And he's going to be a gangster president. And he believes this is what's best for the country. So he shoe flies shoe, and the Native Americans leave. So Andrew Jackson in a nutshell, baby. All right, guys, check out the links below. We got some really great ones for you, including other EDU gurus, other EDU geniuses down there. I mean, if you watch Smarter every day, because when you watch it, you know what happens? You get smarter every day. All right, guys, where attention goes, energy flows. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and aswalaikum.
Mr. Hughes is something else. I debated whether to even show that one or not. But he is different, and it was just about Andrew Jackson. 1840, there is another election, and true to the spirit of the democratic system, Jackson just ran for 2 terms. William Henry Harrison, that military hero from the War of 1812, he has no platform, but we like to reward our generals who help win wars for us by letting them be president. He was portrayed as a common man who grew up in a log cabin, and he loved to drink hard cider. His running mate was a man called John Tyler, a states' right Democrat from Virginia, who joined the Whigs after the nullification crisis. And Harrison won a sweeping victory. He always does. Unfortunately, his inaugural speech was so long in the rain that he got pneumonia and he died within a few very short time. I think it was so many days after he became president. And John Tyler, the vice president, ascended to the presidency. They called him his accidency. And when the Whig majority in Congress attempted to enact the American system into law, Tyler returned to his democratic principles and vetoed every measure, including a new national bank and a higher tariff. His entire cabinet resigned, and the Whigs repudiated him. And in the age of Jacksonian democracy, the presidents could not function without parties. So Tyler accomplished very little in his 4 years in office. As you can see, William Henry Harrison swept. Very few voted for Van Buren. That's what we call stump speaking. And the reason they call it stump speaking is because you're up on a stump, putting your voice up above the heads of the audience. Because if you spoke at the same level they are, your voice is going to be dulled and you can't even hear in the background. So stump speaking or getting on a soapbox. The English politicians used to carry around a wooden box where it used to ship soap in and climb up on it so they would be a little bit above their audience. Now this YouTube is Mr. Green's. He's going to tell you, reiterate what I've told you in a little bit different fashion than Mr. Hughes did. He's not going to just cover Andrew Jackson. He's going to cover the entire time period. Well, fiddlesticks. Here we go.
Start the day off with an extra pick-me-up.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today, after last week's bummer on slavery, we turn to a happier topic, the rise of democratization in the U.S. This was also known as the Age of Jackson. No, Stan, not that Jackson. No, Stan, come on, seriously. No. Yes, that Jackson, Andrew Jackson. Sorry, I just had to check my collar. Right, so you'll recall that the initial democracy of the United States wasn't terribly democratic. Almost all voters were white male landowners. Mr. Green, that's just radically unfair. Exactly, me from the past, but between 1820 and 1850, this started to change. State legislatures lowered or else eliminated the property qualifications for voting, which allowed many more people to vote, so long as they were, both white and male. Mr. Green, so I'd be in, right? Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah, me from the past. Quick privilege check. One of the reasons we study history is so that you can learn that people like you are not actually at the center of history, even though, you've been taught that. But anyway, the whole idea of owning land as a prerequisite prerequisite for voting is sort of Jeffersonian. An individual who works his own land can be truly independent because he doesn't need to rely upon markets to acquire stuff or, God forbid, wages to give him money with which to buy stuff. No, he makes his own stuff, and he doesn't need anybody except for slaves and also women to make shoes and clothes and to cook food and also make children. But in light of the market revolution, the idea of excluding wage workers seemed very outdated. The idea of excluding women and non-white people, though, still quite popular. But this defining characteristic of the age of Jackson really had very little to do with Andrew Jackson himself, because by the time he became president in 1829, every state except for North Carolina, Virginia, and Rhode Island had already gotten rid of their property requirements. In fact, that's probably why he got elected. Right, so you recall that America's mostly fake victory in the War of 1812 and the subsequent collapse of the Federalist Party ushered in the era of good feelings, which was another way of saying that there was basic agreement on most domestic policy. The American system was a program of economic nationalism built on, one, federally financed internal improvements like roads and canals, what we would now call infrastructure, two, tariffs to protect new factories and industries, and three, a national bank that would replace the first Bank of the United States, whose charter expired in 1811. You'll never guess what we called this second bank, unless you guess that we called it the Second Bank of the United States. The main supporters of this American system were our old friend John C. Calhoun and our new friend Henry Clay. Both were Jeffersonian Republicans, which isn't surprising because that was the only political party, but it's kind of surprising because the American system had nothing to do with the agrarian republic that Jefferson had championed. But whatever, this was the era of good feelings, so we're gonna go with it. By the way, this nationalism also extended to foreign affairs. After Latin America won its independence from Spain, President Monroe made a speech proposing that Europe shouldn't try to retake colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And if they did, we would, do stuff. This so-called Monroe Doctrine also said that the U.S. would stay out of European wars. Ha 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 ha, that is hilarious. But we did live up to the other end of it. You'll remember that when the British came for the Falkland Islands, we were like, this shall not stand. Just kidding, we were like, go ahead. Right, so the last era of good feelings president was John Quincy Adams, who was quite the diplomat and expansionist. He actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine, for instance. But in fact, it turns out that all feelings were not good. There was significant disagreement over three main issues. First, many people felt that the federal government shouldn't invest in infrastructure, like James Madison, who'd initially supported those bills, ended up vetoing one of them that included a big spending increase to finance roads and canals. Now, the roads and canals did get built, but in the end, most of the financing fell to the states. There were also big problems with the Second Bank of the United States, which, is why you cannot visit a branch of it these days, but we'll get to that in a minute. And lastly, there was the perennial issue of slavery. In this case, the problem started, as so many problems do, in Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri had enough people in it to become a state, but despite the fact that there were already more than 10,000 slaves there, a New York congressman named James Talmadge made a motion to prohibit the introduction of further slaves into the proposed state. It took almost 2 years to work out the John C. Calhoun storm that blew up after this. Actually, it took more than that. It took until the end of the Civil War, basically. But in the short run, Missouri was allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine was carved out of Massachusetts to keep the balance of things. But the Missouri Compromise also said that no state admitted above the 3630 line of latitude would be allowed to have slaves, except, of course, for Missouri itself, which, as you can see, is well above the line. Anyway, this solution to westward expansion worked out magnificently, provided that you enjoy civil wars. So Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was still alive, which gives you some context for how young the nation truly was, wrote that the Missouri Compromise was, quote, like a fire bell in the night that awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union. Eventually, almost. But in the short term, it did mean the rise of political parties. So America was becoming more democratic, but if there was only one political party, that democratic spirit had nowhere to go. Fortunately, there was a tiny little magician named Martin Van Buren. They really did call him the Little Magician, by the way, also the Red Fox of Kinderhook, but we remember him as the worst-haired president. So despite having been president of the United States, Van Buren is arguably more important for having invented the Democratic Party. He was first to realize that national political parties could be a good thing. So I mentioned that Martin Van Buren was known as the Little Magician, and I know this sounds a little bit silly, but I think it's telling. You see, Van Buren was only the second American president with a well-used nickname, and the first was his immediate predecessor, Andrew Jackson, or Old Hickory. Why does this matter? Well, when you're actually having to campaign for office, as all presidential candidates did after the election of 1828, and you're trying to appeal to the newly enfranchised common man, what better way to seem like a regular guy than to have a nickname? I mean, if you think this is crazy, just think of the nicknames of some of our most popular presidents. Honest Abe, the Bull Moose, the Gipper. Even our lesser-known presidents had nicknames. Young Hickory, Handsome Frank, Old Rough and Ready, Big Steve. James Buchanan, and I am not making this up, was Old Public Functionary. What are you gonna vote for? Oh, I think the Old Public Functionary. He seems competent. As it happens, he wasn't. So by now you're probably wondering, where does Andrew Jackson fit into all of this? When we last caught up with Jackson, he was winning the Battle of New Orleans shortly after the end of the War of 1812. He continued his bellicose ways, fighting Indians in Florida, although he was not actually authorized to do so, and became so popular from all of his Indian killing that he decided to run for president in 1824. The election of 1824 was very close, and it went to the House, where John Quincy Adams was eventually declared the winner, and Jackson denounced this as a corrupt bargain. So in 1828, Jackson ran a much more negative campaign. One of his campaign slogans was, "Vote for Andrew Jackson, who can fight, not John Quincy Adams, who can write." Adams' supporters responded by arguing that having a literate president wasn't such a bad thing, and also by accusing Jackson of being a murderer, which, given his frequent habit of dueling and massacring, he sort of was. So as you can see, the quality of discourse in American political campaigns has come a long way. Anyway, Jackson won. Jackson ran as the champion of the common man, and in a way he was. I mean, he had little formal schooling, and in some ways he was the archetypal self-made man. Jackson's policies defined the new Democratic Party, which had formerly been known as the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. So who were these new Democrats? Well, generally they tended to be lower to middle-class men, usually farmers, who were suspicious of the widening gap between the rich and the poor that was one of the results of the market revolution. And they were particularly worried about bankers, merchants, and speculators who seemed to be getting rich without actually producing anything. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. This vision probably would have carried the day, except a new party arose in response to Jackson's election. The Whigs. No, Stan, the Whigs. Yes. The American Whigs took their name from the English Whigs, who were opposed to absolute monarchy. And the American Whigs felt that Andrew Jackson was grabbing so much power for the executive branch that he was turning himself into King Andrew. So the Whigs were big supporters of the American system and its active federal government. You know, tariffs, infrastructure, etc. Their greatest support was in the Northeast, especially from businessmen and bankers who benefited from those tariffs and the stability provided by a national bank. And they also thought the government should promote moral character, because that was necessary for a person to act as a truly independent citizen. So Jackson's policies must have been pretty egregious for them to spawn an entirely new political party. What did he actually do as president? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. Let's start with nullification. So in 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of 1828 because they were not yet in the habit of marketing their bills via naming them with funny acronyms. Jackson supported this in spite of the fact that it benefited manufacturers. The tariff raised prices on imported manufactured goods made of wool and iron, which enraged South Carolina because they'd put all their money into slavery and none into industry. So unlike Northerners, who could avoid the higher prices by manufacturing sweaters and pants and such at home, South Carolinians would have to pay more. They were so angry at this tariff of abominations that the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify it. Jackson didn't take kindly to this affront to federal power, but South Carolina persisted, and when Congress passed a new tariff in 1832, one that actually lowered the duties, the Palmetto State's government nullified it. Jackson responded by getting Congress to pass the Force Act, which authorized him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes. A full-blown crisis was averted when Congress passed a new tariff in 1833, and South Carolina relented. This smelled a bit of dictatorship, armed tax collectors and all, and helped to cement Jackson's reputation as a tyrant, at least among the Whigs. And then we have the Native Americans. Much of Jackson's reputation there was based on killing them, so it's no surprise that he supported Southern states' efforts to appropriate Indian lands and make the Indians move. This support was formalized in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which Jackson supported. The law provided funds to relocate Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminole Indians from their homes in Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. In response, these tribes adopted a novel approach and sued the government. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's actions in removing the Cherokees violated their treaties with the federal government and that they had a right to their land. To which Jackson supposedly responded by saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." So Jackson set the stage for the forced removal of the Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma, but it actually took place in the winter of 1838-1839 under Jackson's successor, Van Buren. At least 1/4 of the 18,000 Indians died on the forced march that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Boy, Thought Bubble, you do know how to end on a downer, but Thank you. But Andrew Jackson also changed our banking system. Just as today, banks were very important to the industrial and mercantile development of the U.S. And at the beginning of Jackson's presidency, American banking was dominated by the Second National Bank, which you'll remember had been established by Congress as part of the American system. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. When I inevitably fail to guess the author of the mystery document, I get shocked with the shock pen. The powers, privileges, and favors bestowed upon it in the original charter by increasing the value of the stock far above its par value operated as a gratuity of many millions to its stockholders. Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. The many millions which this act proposes to bestow on the stockholders of the existing bank must come directly or indirectly out of the earnings of the American people. Stan, I know this one. It is not conceivable how the present stockholders can have any claim to the special favor of government. Should the bank's influence become concentrated, as it may under the operation of such an act as this, in the hands of a self-elected directory, will there not be cause to tremble for the purity of our elections? It is Andrew Jackson's veto of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Yes! So in 1832, bank leader Nicholas Biddle persuaded Congress to pass a bill extending the life of the Second U.S. Bank for 20 years. Jackson thought that the bank would use its money to oppose his re-election in 1836, so he vetoed that bill. In fact, the reason I knew that was from the veto message is because it talks about the bank as an instrument to subvert democracy. Jackson set himself up as a defender of the lower classes by vetoing the bank's charter. Now, Whigs took exception to the idea that the president was somehow a more democratic representative of the people than the legislature, but in the end, Jackson's view won out. He used the veto power more than any prior president, turning it into a powerful tool of policy, which it remains to this day, by the way. So the Second Bank of the U.S. expired in 1836, which meant that suddenly we had no central institution with which to control federal funds. Jackson ordered that money should be dispersed into local banks, unsurprisingly preferencing ones that were friendly to him. These so-called pet banks were another version of rewarding political supporters that Jackson liked to call rotation in office. Opponents called this tactic of awarding government offices to political favorites the spoils system. Anyway, these smaller banks proceeded to print more and more paper money because, you know, free money. Like between 1833 and 1837, the face value of banknotes in circulation rose from $10 million to $149 million, and that meant inflation. Initially, states loved all this new money that they could use to finance internal improvements, but inflation is really bad for wage workers and also eventually everyone. So all this out-of-control inflation, coupled with rampant land speculation, eventually led to an economic collapse, the Panic of 1837. The subsequent depression lasted until 1843, and Jackson's bank policy proved to be arguably the most disastrous fiscal policy in American history, which is really saying something. It also had a major effect on American politics because business-oriented Democrats became Whigs, and the remaining Democrats further aligned with agrarian interests, which meant slavery. So the age of Jackson was more democratic than anything that came before, and it gave us the beginnings of modern American politics. I mean, Jackson was the first president to really expand executive power and to argue that the president is the most important democratically elected official in the country. One of the things that makes Andrew Jackson's presidency so interesting and also so problematic is that he was elected via a more democratic process, but he concentrated more power in the executive in a thoroughly undemocratic way. In the end, Andrew Jackson probably was the worst American president to end up on currency, particularly given his disastrous fiscal policies. But the age of Jackson is still important. And it's worth remembering that all that stuff in American politics started out with the expansion of democracy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history.
And so it is. King Andy. That concludes our short trip through Chapter 10. The main things I want you to remember, of course, are the business about Andrew Jackson and the Monroe Doctrine. Chapter 11, the next chapter, is the peculiar institution. It deals all about slavery, the beginnings of slavery, life under slavery, the slave culture, and, of course, the resistance to slavery. It can be a very depressing chapter, but it's very important that we do take care of it.